For 40 long years, he traveled across 19 states, leaving behind a trail of bodies that police either failed to find or simply chose to ignore, allowing him to become the most prolific serial killer in American history without a single alarm bell ringing. But the most horrifying twist wasn't his body count. It was that his victims, all marginalized, all women, made his crimes perfectly invisible until he decided to tell the world about them decades later. Welcome to the shadows, where justice often sleeps, and welcome back to True Crime World. Samuel Little's life began in Georgia in June 1940. Born to a mother who was a teenage sex worker and addict, birthing him while incarcerated. Abandoned shortly thereafter and raised by his grandmother in Ohio, Little never knew stability, his childhood defined by poverty and neglect. His deadly obsession was ignited in kindergarten, a seemingly innocuous, gentle touch on his neck by a female teacher, a feeling that resonated and morphed into a dark fantasy throughout his troubled schooling. This twisted fascination was cemented by a morbid image he kept in his room, torn from a true crime magazine, the portrait of a woman strangled to death. By his teens, Little had dropped out, addicted to drugs and petty theft, graduating quickly from stealing bikes to breaking and entering, becoming a regular fixture at correctional facilities. At age 13, he was sent to a boys' technical school for stealing a bicycle, where he was disciplined over 40 times for fighting and violations in less than 2 years. The reform school did nothing to reform him. Instead, it honed his belligerence and confirmed his path toward a life of crime, leading to his first adult prison sentence in 1961 for breaking into a furniture warehouse, during which time he discovered his affinity for boxing and painting. After his early release in 1964, he began to drift across America, performing odd jobs like working as a cemetery caretaker and an ambulance attendant while continuously committing petty theft and assaults. Between 1964 and 1975, Little was arrested 26 times across 11 states for crimes including assault, grand larceny, and fraud. The true demon emerged on New Year's Eve 1970. 30 years old and already a habitual offender, Little encountered Mary Brophy, a 33-year-old professional sex worker, in a Miami bar. Mary, with long blonde hair and dressed in a striking red outfit and black fishnet stockings, caught his attention when she casually stroked her own neck. To Little, this was a divine, guiding signal. They drove together to a remote, empty lot near a swamp. There, in the darkness, he choked the life from her, an act that terrified him initially, prompting him to bury her hastily in the nearby forest. When hunters discovered Mary's decomposing body 3 weeks later, authorities were unable to identify her through fingerprints and, given the high blood alcohol content, ruled the death ambiguous, perhaps an accidental overdose or natural causes. No murder investigation was launched, and the body was buried as an unidentified female. Little learned the lesson that would define the next 4 decades of his life. If the victim was marginalized, the crime was disposable and undetectable. Freed by judicial indifference, Samuel Little embraced his inner monster. He began to stalk the back roads and alleys, his targets strictly limited to sex workers, drug users, and those society had already discarded, almost exclusively poor African American women. His chosen method was always manual strangulation, an intimate, tactile pleasure he equated with deep personal satisfaction. When interrogated about the feeling, he would chillingly confess that it felt like being in heaven, like sleeping with Marilyn Monroe. He viewed these women as easily accessible fruits ripe for the picking, stating, "The whole place was like a vineyard. The girls were grapes. All the way along the route, he'd pick a grape and eat it." Between 1970 and 1975 alone, his cross-country drift, punctuated by dozens of arrests for lesser crimes across 11 states, masked a spreading trail of homicides. This pattern of misclassification was Little's shield. In 1974, Martha Cunningham, A 34-year-old African-American woman in Tennessee was found dead, bruised and disheveled, her valuables missing. Forensic experts failed to identify strangulation as the cause, and given her medical history, police attributed the death to an epileptic seizure and closed the file. By the mid-1970s, Little was involved with Oriania, a professional thief nearly 30 years his senior. They traveled together, funding their life through theft, but his nightly hunts continued. In September 1976, outside St. Louis, Missouri, a young black woman with her hands bound managed to escape him and reached a nearby house for help. Police quickly apprehended Little based on her description, but because the victim was a sex worker, her testimony lacked credibility. Little was only jailed for 3 months for minor charges. This constant failure of the system to take his crime seriously emboldened him further. The ultimate test of his impunity arrived in 1982. Following the murder of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount in Florida and 22-year-old Melinda Rose LaCasada in Mississippi, both sex workers found strangled and nude, both last seen getting into a brown car, police finally connected the dots and arrested Little, the owner of the matching vehicle. Prosecutors brought him to trial, even securing testimony from 2 other surviving sex workers he had previously assaulted. Yet Little denied everything, and the jury, deeming the testimony of marginalized women unreliable and lacking definitive physical evidence at the time, acquitted Samuel Little on all murder charges. He walked free, the legal dismissal a resounding confirmation of his strategy. Though he faced subsequent minor sentences for battery and kidnapping, including a 2.5-year term following an incident in 1984 in which police found an unconscious, bruised woman in the trunk of his car, the systematic murder spree went on completely unhindered. He even managed to escape a second Florida murder investigation involving Patricia Ann Mount's death, when his companion Danny gave crucial testimony that Little had driven out alone on the night Patricia disappeared and meticulously cleaned the car the next morning. But without hard evidence, Little was acquitted once more. By February 1987, the 47-year-old predator had already executed over a dozen documented murders across the country. But his true hunting ground shifted to the vast anonymity of Los Angeles. In the ensuing years, even as his longtime companion Orania passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage, Little continued to prowl, his crimes escalating in frequency and brutality in the LA area. Little later confessed he always went out hunting only after Orania was asleep, though whether she knew the true extent of his activities remains unknown. Unbeknownst to law enforcement agencies across 19 different states, Samuel Little had, by 2005, accumulated a body count he would later proudly estimate at 93 victims, a number far exceeding the combined totals of figures like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, cementing his place in the history books not just as a serial killer, but as a ghost allowed to roam for 40 years because he exclusively targeted the people society had forgotten. When asked why he chose this specific demographic, his response was chillingly pragmatic. If I went into a white neighborhood and killed a white girl under 20 years old, everybody would know about it the next day. But if the victim was an African-American girl, nobody would know about it for a long time. And so, protected by the societal apathy he relied upon, Samuel Little drifted, a phantom moving across the American landscape, leaving behind a trail of unseen bodies. For 40 years, the sheer volume of his criminality allowed him to blend into the scenery, a petty thief and transient whose violent tendencies were written off as isolated incidents by a fragmented bureaucracy. But time has a way of catching up, often in the most unexpected and routine ways. The curtain finally began to fall on Wednesday, September 5, 2012. It was not a brilliant piece of detective work that brought him down, but a simple bureaucratic sweep. Acting on an old California fugitive warrant related to drug trafficking, police zeroed in on a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. Their target? Samuel Little, then 72 years old, a career criminal whose rap sheet spanned 11 states, but whose most monstrous deeds remained completely unknown. The drug charge was negligible, a necessary evil to get him off the street and repatriated to California to answer for his minor recurring crimes. Following standard procedure, once in custody, officers collected Little's DNA and uploaded it to the national database. The wait was standard. The results were anything but. The system, designed to connect dots that individual police departments missed, flashed immediate, undeniable matches to 3 unsolved Los Angeles County homicides, cold cases stretching back decades. The man they had arrested for a minor drug violation was suddenly linked directly to 3 murders where the victims, all marginalized women, had been strangled, assaulted, and forgotten. The first match was to the case of Carolyn Elise Sperling, found dead on July 13, 1987, beside a heap of refuse in an LA alley. Her body was heavily bruised, bearing signs of sexual assault. The ultimate cause of death, asphyxiation. At the time, she was just another statistic, a street worker whose murder generated little public outrage or sustained investigation. The second match followed quickly. Guadalupe Apodaca, discovered dead on September 3, 1987, in a desolate, abandoned automotive repair shop. Her body, too, bore the grim signature, assault and strangulation. 2 months apart, the same killer, and absolutely no suspects identified. The final, horrifying link was to Audrey Nelson Everest, whose life was extinguished and body discarded in a trash receptacle on August 14, 1989. She, like the others, was a sex worker. Her paltry valuables stolen, and her life ended by the crushing grip of a powerful hand around her throat. The commonality was chilling. 3 women of the street, strangled to death in nearly identical fashion, their jewelry and money often taken, now unequivocally linked by a single strand of DNA belonging to the septuagenarian drug fugitive sitting in a holding cell. The ensuing investigation immediately uncovered a lifetime of violence hidden beneath a veneer of petty crime. Little's decades-long history included not only theft and fraud, but also numerous arrests for assault and attempted rape across the South and Midwest. He had been incarcerated dozens of times, released repeatedly, always moving, always blending. He was the perpetual motion machine of American criminality, his transient nature ensuring that no single law enforcement agency ever saw the whole picture. He was a puzzle piece that only the unified power of the National DNA Database could assemble. In January 2013, Samuel Little was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the cases proceeding to the Los Angeles Superior Court. Prosecutors, armed with the ironclad forensic evidence, faced a man who still steadfastly denied any involvement, relying on the same dismissive attitude toward the women he targeted that had protected him for 40 years. Yet, the prosecution had more than just genetics on their side. They located a surviving victim from one of Little's prior attempted murder cases. A woman who had miraculously escaped his grasp years earlier and was willing to testify against him. Her dramatic presence in court shattered any illusion of plausible innocence Little might have maintained. The combined force of DNA and living testimony proved overwhelming, exposing the man who insisted he was merely a victim of circumstance and misidentification. Despite his claims of innocence and his continuous stubborn refusal to accept responsibility, his defense was futile. The jury found him guilty. On September 25, 2014, after nearly a year and a half in custody, Samuel Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the California State Prison, Los Angeles County, a facility for men where he would spend the rest of his natural life. Trapped and confined, he continued to cling to his narrative of martyrdom, filing appeals and insisting he was wrongly accused. For 4 years, he stewed in the institutional reality of his punishment, a forgotten, aging man. He had been captured, tried and convicted. Justice, however delayed, had been served for Sperling, Apodaca, and Everest. But unbeknownst to the courts, the FBI, or the countless police departments he had evaded, this three-count conviction was merely the tip of a terrifying iceberg. A sliver of sunlight on a sprawling landscape of carnage that stretched from the swamps of Florida to the desert roads of Nevada. Crimes numbering not in the single digits, but in the scores. And soon, an investigator in Texas probing the cold case of a woman named Denise Brothers would inadvertently give Samuel Little exactly what he needed to finally unburden his dark soul. The arrest of Samuel Little on September 5, 2012 was purely incidental, a bureaucratic ripple catching a great white shark by the tail. At 72, Little was picked up in a Louisville, Kentucky homeless shelter, not for murder, but for an outstanding California drug warrant. Though he was a known career criminal, a thief, a hustler, a repeat offender spanning decades and a dozen states, the magnitude of the darkness he harbored was utterly unknown to the authorities who processed him that day. Routine procedure dictated that a DNA swab be taken, a mundane action that immediately unlocked decades of horror. Little's genetic code matched 3 previously cold, unsolved murders in Los Angeles. Carolyn Elise Sperling, found near a trash dump in July 1987. Guadalupe Apodaca, found in an abandoned auto shop in September 1987. And Audrey Nelson Everest, found in a dumpster in August 1989. All 3 victims were sex workers, marginalized women subjected to sexual assault and ultimately strangled, their meager valuables stolen. The DNA proved a single killer was responsible, and that killer was Samuel Little. Despite his lifetime of offenses, it took this random drug arrest to finally connect him to the capital crimes he had committed. In January 2013, Little was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Though he vehemently denied all charges during his Los Angeles Superior Court trial, the overwhelming DNA evidence, supported by the testimony of a surviving victim from a previous attempted murder charge, was irrefutable. On September 25, 2014, Samuel Little was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, banished to the California State Prison in Los Angeles County, a facility he immediately began to despise. He remained defiant, clinging to his claims of innocence until the shifting sands of fate and the desperation of an aging criminal finally opened the floodgates. 4 years later, in May 2018, a Texas investigator probing the 1994 cold case of Denise Brothers, a 38-year-old sex worker murdered in Odessa, noticed the striking similarities between the MO of the LA cases and the manner in which Brothers was strangled and left naked in an empty lot. Recognizing that Little had been in Texas at the time of the murder, the investigators, joined by 2 FBI agents, traveled to California to interview the now 78-year-old inmate. Little, frail from diabetes and heart disease, quickly realized the leverage he possessed. Complaining bitterly about the conditions in his current prison, he offered a shocking bargain. He would confess to all his crimes, cooperate fully, and help close every open case, provided he was transferred to a better, more comfortable facility in West Texas and guaranteed that the death penalty would be taken off the table. The deal was struck, and the results were immediate and explosive. Little confessed to the 3 California murders he had always denied, and then described in gruesome detail the murder of Denise Brothers, recalling how he had lured her into his white car, driven her to a secluded alley, and, claiming he was an artist who wanted to sketch her, suddenly attacked, pulling her into the back seat, one hand strangling her, the other self-gratifying, telling her, "You will always be mine," before brutally throttling her until life left her body. The investigators listened, horrified, but Little was only warming up. He began to recall crimes that had never even been formally logged by police, a catalog of murders stretching from 1970 to 2005. He spoke of a Black American woman in New Orleans in 1982, describing her beautiful dress before recounting how he had strangled her and tossed her body into a river. He described a sex worker in Las Vegas in 1993, a woman who wore a long wig over her short hair, whom he killed in a motel room, transported in his trunk, and rolled down a suburban hillside, a body likely never found. In April 1994, in Little Rock, Arkansas, he detailed a 3-day spree with another victim before murdering her on a back road and dumping her in a field. Little had a terrifyingly photographic memory for faces, clothes, and locations, though his grasp of specific dates was often hazy. He confessed to strangling 93 people across 19 states, almost exclusively targeting marginalized women. Black sex workers, drug users, and those society had forgotten. When asked why he chose such victims, his chilling response illuminated the systemic blindness that allowed him to operate for decades. If I got into a white neighborhood and killed a white girl under 20, everyone would know the next day. But if the victim was a Black American girl, perhaps no one would know about it for a long time. Describing the act of killing, his face would light up with perverted joy. It was like I was in paradise, like sleeping with Marilyn Monroe. He saw his victims as succulent fruit, saying everywhere was like a vineyard, the girls were the grapes. Everywhere he went, he picked a grape and tasted it, forever fixated on the act of strangulation. Little's murderous journey began on New Year's Eve 1970 when he strangled his first confirmed victim, Mary Brophy, in a desolate Florida marshland after she had innocently brushed her own neck, triggering his deep-seated strangulation fetish, an obsession first sparked in kindergarten when a teacher touched his own neck. His life had been a tragic cycle from the start. Born in jail in 1940 to a prostitute mother who attempted to abort him, abandoned as an infant, and steered into a life of crime by poverty and neglect. His criminal history was a rotating door of larceny, assault, and brief prison stints, all punctuated by an escalating pattern of murder that went completely unrecognized until his DNA proved the link 4 decades later, because law enforcement consistently dismissed the deaths of women like Mary Brophy and Martha Cunningham as accidents or overdoses. The raw volume and spatial breadth of his confessions forced the FBI to take unprecedented action. By October 2019, after meticulous cross-referencing and collaboration with dozens of law enforcement agencies, the FBI officially declared Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, confirming responsibility for over 50 cases and actively investigating the remaining claims. They released more than 30 of his disturbing, detailed victim portraits to the public, hoping to finally identify those whose lives had been cruelly extinguished. Transferred to Texas in December 2018 for the Denise Brothers case, Samuel Little faced a 4th life sentence, but had finally won his better prison conditions, cooperating with authorities until the end of his days. He died in custody in December 2020 at the age of 80, taking the identities of many of his victims to the grave. Though the justice system finally caught Samuel Little, his crimes stand as a brutal testament to the failure to protect the most vulnerable among us, the women whose lives were deemed disposable until a murderer chose to boast about taking them. This tragedy forces us to confront difficult truths about who we choose to protect and whose suffering goes unnoticed. If you found this deep dive into the darkest corners of criminal history illuminating, please ensure you like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to True Crime World for more in-depth investigative stories. We have solved Little's case, but the question remains, are there other Samuel Littles operating today, hidden in plain sight because their victims are overlooked?